Chapter 1. As the dragon roared in anger, the knight of the valiant sword laughed aloud. "Beware, worm," he shouted. "Your last hour has come. You have eaten your last maiden." At this the dragon roared again and reared up to strike at the knight with his dreadful claws. A blast of fire gushed from his mouth, scorching but not daunting his brave attacker. Then the mighty beast fell forward over the unflinching knight and— "Uncle, uncle, I have been calling you to supper again and again. Put down that book and come and eat." Her uncle raised his eyes reluctantly from the page. "My dear Maria," he said, "I am very sorry not to have heard you, but the knight of the valiant sword was in mortal combat with the dreadful dragon, and— Oh, uncle, not those fairy tales again." "Fairy tales? Fairy tales? These are the deeds of great heroes. Arthur, Lancelot, Roland." "Uncle, that's hundreds of years ago. We're in the 16th century now. Stop living in the past with all those old knights and come into the present. At least come and have supper." Maria's uncle lived in a small village in a dusty corner of Spain. He was a bony man of about 50, the sort of old-fashioned gentleman who decorates his study with a rusty lance and a worm-eaten shield to help him live in the past. He had no wife, but he had given his niece a home. She was a sensible girl, aged about 18. A motherly housekeeper looked after them both. His friends in the village were the two educated men, Thomas the priest and Nicholas the barber. He had little to do, and so he read. All through the long winter evenings he shut himself up in his study. The flickering candle flame filled the corners of the room with ghostly shadows of giants and of dragons, but the only books he read were about the knights of old who roamed the countryside seeking adventure. When summer came, he sat outside and read under his orange trees. No giants hovered in the sharp shadows now, but the horizon stretched out an invitation. Here there was dust and flies. There was adventure. Time passed. He started to believe that the old stories were true histories. Then the heat, or too much reading, took his mind further into madness. He knew that he too must be a knight, must travel out on a quest. He must seek adventure. He searched through all the attics of the house. He upset piles of rubbish that had been carefully heaped up over many years. At last he found it, his grandfather's suit of armor. It was old, it was rusty, it was broken, but he dragged it out through the mess he had made, down the ladder, and spread it out in his bedroom. It would fit, it could be cleaned, it could be mended. As he stood scratching his head, looking at the armor, working out what needed to be done, he remembered the helmet. Where was it? Back into the darkness of the attic he went. When his eyes adjusted to the gloom again, he found the helmet without trouble. He carefully removed the nest of mice that was in it and placed them inside a rusty bucket. Cleaned, mended, and polished, the armor fitted well enough to please his mad mind. The helmet was another problem. The visor was gone. He had turned the attic over many times, but he could not find it. His mouth and chin would be quite unprotected. He could not go out into the world like that. The only answer was to make a new one. The only material he had was cardboard. Carefully cut, painted, and polished, it looked a little strange, but safety was the important thing. He picked up his sword and made a cut at it to test it. In one moment he had destroyed what it had taken him 1 week to make. The next visor that he made had strips of tin attached behind the card. This one he did not test. It looked strong enough, but all he could find to tie it together was some green ribbon. He had solved the problem of the visor, but this was just the beginning. He had 3 more problems. The first was what to call his horse. 4 days' hard thought produced Rocinante. This grand title, it means nag of nags, hardly fitted the beast, for he was all skin and bones and angles. All knights had their ladies they loved and honored. In the next village he had once seen a farm girl who had caught his fancy. He had never spoken to her, but he could serve her and send her gifts and captives. He called her Dulcinea del Toboso, or the sweet one from the village of Toboso. His last problem was his own name. The particular dusty corner of Spain that he went crazy in was called La Mancha, and so, after 8 days, he had the answer to this final and most difficult of his problems. He called himself Don Quixote de la Mancha. Chapter 2. One July morning, Don Quixote slipped out the back gate before his niece and his housekeeper were awake. You must not think he was crazy through and through. He was sane enough to know that they would have stopped him if they had known what he was doing. The fields were sparkling in the dew, and there was a freshness in the world that matched his hopes. He rode off on his bony horse in full armor, with shield and lance, a true knight-errant. Then the dreadful truth struck him. How could he pretend to be a knight? He had never been knighted. He was just a country gentleman. How could he ride through the world upholding honor and justice if he himself was a fraud? So Don Quixote rode and worried. The sun rose higher in the sky, and its heat seemed to fry his brains inside his helmet. As his worry chased itself more and more quickly through his hot head, bits of the old stories were knocked loose from his memory and joined the whirligig of his mind. At last he stood up in his stirrups, raised his lance in his hands to point to the sky, and shouted with relief, anyone I meet can knight me." Then he rode on, trying to arrange tidily in his mind all the occasions he had read of when men had been knighted after some deed of valor by the first stranger they had met. He quietly forgot that he had not yet managed any deed of valor, unless you count riding under the scorching sun all day in a metal suit. So Don Quixote rode on over the dusty plain without meeting any adventures, or indeed even another human being. Excitement, heat, loneliness, hunger, and thirst, for he had forgotten to pack any supplies, must have addled his brain still further. Towards evening he reached one of those inns conveniently placed to welcome travelers at the end of a day's journey. Don Quixote's brain saw a castle gleaming in the evening sun. Towers rose in his mind from each corner, battlements crowned the walls, and a drawbridge spanned the ditch. 2 beautiful maidens stood by the open gateway to welcome travelers. "Ho, maidens!" Don Quixote called out. "Fear not, the defender of virtue has come." The 2 servant girls who had come out for a breath of fresh evening air stared at this madman who was wearing clothes so old-fashioned that they looked like fancy dress. "Get off with you, you loony," one of them called out. Don Quixote let out such a great bellow of rage that the innkeeper himself came out to see what was happening. Silhouetted against the evening sky was a warrior from the history books, shouting at his servants and waving a lance. The innkeeper was fat and cautious. He knew madmen must be humored, and he knew that their money is just as good as anyone else's. "Come in, great sir," he called, "and welcome to you." So Don Quixote clattered into the courtyard of the inn, disturbing the hens and alarming the cats. He slid from Rocinante's back and handed the reins to the innkeeper. "Take care of my steed," he said. "You may not have ever seen so fine a mount before." "No," the innkeeper said, "I have never before seen an animal like this one." And he stopped himself from slapping Rocinante on the rump for fear of cutting his hand on the bones. The two servant girls now came to help him off with his armor. The knots and the ribbons holding his helmet together had tightened, and they broke their nails trying to undo them. "Fetch some scissors," one said. "No, no, leave it," ordered Don Quixote. He was afraid that if the ribbon was cut, he would not be able to find anything else to fasten it back on with tomorrow. So he spent the evening in his long undergarments and his helmet. He found it impossible to get a cup to his mouth, and had to quench his burning thirst through a straw. When he felt more comfortable, he called the landlord and fell to his knees in front of him. "Here will I stay, kneeling at your feet, most noble constable of this great castle, until you grant me my one fervent wish." The innkeeper managed not to laugh as he replied, "I will certainly grant any wish that is within my power." "Then let me keep vigil in the chapel of the castle all through this night, and then at dawn I beg you to raise me to the honor of knighthood with your own sword." The innkeeper thought of the extra he could charge on his bill, coughed, and then replied, "Most certainly, sire." There was, of course, no chapel in the inn, and not many rooms either, but this mad scheme of his will keep him quiet and out of harm's way till morning, he thought. "Our chapel, sire, is being rebuilt. We have a temporary altar in the corner of our inner bailey. Please wait here while I go to make sure all is ready for you." The innkeeper found 2 planks and put them on top of the horse trough outside the stables next to the dung heap. Don Quixote gathered up his saddle, armor, and lance when the innkeeper summoned him. They crossed the starlit courtyard, the short, fat innkeeper in front, the tall, bony, would-be knight behind, pieces of ironwork falling from his arms at every step. He piled his belongings on top of the planks, stepped back, and knelt down to pray. Chapter 3. The innkeeper's hopes of a quiet night were spoiled by a carter who had stopped too long for a quick drink. He rolled out into the courtyard with his mule. "What's this?" he roared. "What tinker has been piling all this old iron on the water trough?" As he threw the armor clanging to the cobbles, Don Quixote woke from dreams of glory. He saw, lit by the full moon that had now risen, a dark knight plainly about to attack him. Don Quixote seized his sword and swung a mighty blow at the carter. This certainly would have sliced the man's head off if Don Quixote had not slipped in the ooze from the dung heap. As he fell, his sword cut through the reins of the terrified mule. The animal kicked out, scattered the armor, and alarmed itself even more. When the innkeeper came out and saw what had been happening, he said to himself, "This madman must go." He grabbed the mule and led it off into a stable. He pushed the carter in after it and bolted the door. Then he came to Don Quixote, who had struggled into most of his, by now, rather dented armor, and said, "Well fought, great sir. You have vanquished the evil spirit marvelously, and you have earned your knighthood. Praise God that I was here to witness such a conflict. Pay me first what you owe me, and then I will perform the ceremony, and you can be on your way." "I have no money," Don Quixote answered. "I never heard of any of the knights in the histories carrying money, or of them being asked for it in any castle in which they stayed." "Nor did you ever read of them visiting the lavatory, begging your worship's pardon, but it is plain that they must have. Just so they also carried money, and they paid for what they had like any other Christian gentleman, and took a clean shirt with them too," he added, noticing how dirty Don Quixote was after his fall. "What a poor knight I am!" Don Quixote exclaimed. "I have clean forgotten the shirt." "Leave that for now," said the innkeeper. "Kneel down and give me your sword." "The words, you must say the right words," said Don Quixote, anxious to be properly knighted. The innkeeper pulled his account book from his pocket and read out a long list of all he was owed, gabbling through it as quickly as he could. Then he took the sword and struck Don Quixote across the back as hard as he could. "Arise, Sir Knight, arise and ride forth at once to seek adventure," he said. And so, in the middle of the night, the new knight left the inn on Rocinante with joy in his heart, a bruise on his back, dents in his armor, and a rather unpleasant smell. As Don Quixote rode through the cool dawn, his brain worked slowly and calmly again. The constable of the castle was right, he thought. I must return home. Then I can set out again properly, a knighted knight, with money in my pocket and a clean shirt in my pouch. And my squire, he thought suddenly. Every knight has a faithful squire. How they must have laughed at me at the castle for my ignorance. And so Don Quixote brooded on his mistakes and shortcomings as the sun rose higher into the sky. "I have not defended the honor of my lady, the beautiful Dulcinea del Toboso," he shouted out loud suddenly, as the heat once again struck his helmet. "What a miserable knight I am!" As luck would have it, he arrived at that moment at a crossroads, and so he waited there for a traveler to challenge. At last he saw a band of merchants traveling towards him. "Stop!" he shouted. "You shall not pass until you declare that my lady, Dulcinea del Toboso, is the most beautiful lady in the whole of the world, or the whole of Spain either, for that matter." The merchants saw a man in ancient, dented, dusty armor, waving a sword in his right hand and shaking a lance in his left. "How can we?" one of them shouted back, "unless you show us a picture of this lady dustbin of two boos." Don Quixote realized that he had again failed to equip himself as a knight should. His temper, not helped by his wait in the hot sun and the feeling that everyone was laughing at him, began to fray. "I am a knight of honor," he shouted. "If I say it is so, then it is so." "Oh, that's all right, then," the merchant said. "We'll all agree that she is the most beautiful lady in the world, if you say so. Even if she squints in one eye and the other eye oozes, and even if—" Don Quixote's temper snapped at this, and he dug his spurs violently into Rocinante's sides to charge the merchants. Rocinante, who had been dozing peacefully, was so startled by the spurs that he slipped and fell. Don Quixote clung to the ground and lay there helplessly while the merchants beat him with sticks. At last they tired and they rode off, leaving Don Quixote crying out pitifully. And there he stayed, for you will remember it was a quiet road, and he lay there till evening. His cries grew fainter and fainter, but they were at last heard by a passer-by. He, by a happy chance, was a man of Don Quixote's own village. He helped our hero back on to Rocinante, and led him, groaning faintly, back to his home. His niece and housekeeper were delighted. They took his armor from him, bathed his wounds, and put him to bed. And there he dreamed such dreams as would have frightened them if they had been able to see into his poor bruised head. They fetched his two friends, the barber and the priest, and asked them for help. They agreed that only desperate remedies would work. "Our poor friend is so confused in his head," said the barber, "that we should take advantage of it. Let us burn his books and brick up the doorway into his study. Then he will not be able to read those stories that have turned his mind, and he will believe he has woken from a bad dream, and then he will soon be back to his old self again." And that is what they did. All Don Quixote's precious books were turned to ash. Bricks were hastily laid and whitewashed across the doorway. Don Quixote said nothing. He knew an evil enchanter had done it all. He must go out into the world and seek him and destroy him. Only then would his study and his books rematerialize.